Good day. Today is Tuesday, 11th March 2025. Talks between the Ukrainians and the Americans have started in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. There's been an enormous drone attack by Ukraine against Russia. But the situation which I will start this program with, the situation which I will discuss first, as I have discussed in all my recent programs, will be the situation in Kursk, which is becoming more dramatic literally by the hour. In fact, it is very difficult to keep up with the pace of events. Well, where to start then with statements made yesterday by the Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief, General Syrsky. He has reassured us that the Ukrainians have the situation completely under control. He did a post on social media. He said, "I made a decision to strengthen our grouping with the necessary forces and means, including electronic warfare and unmanned components." He said that the dynamics of fighting between the Kursk and Sumy regions were under the control of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. The last is a direct quote from him. And he also said that currently there is no threat of encirclement of our units in Kursk region, but he did accept that Ukrainian forces were under some pressure from the Russians and were having to fall back to positions that are easier to hold. The units are making timely measures to maneuver to favourable defence lines. I remember Syrsky saying very much the same things at the time of the fall of Avdiivka. They seemed to be crass and absurd at the time, and frankly insulting to the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers, caught up in the maelstrom that has become the Battle of Kursk, and a Battle of Avdiivka at the time, and of course today in the actually far worse situation that we see playing out in Kursk region. They look even more absurd. I will say that one part of Syrsky's comments is true. He does appear to have ordered redeployments of troops from eastern Donbass from western Donbass to Kursk region. Apparently the Aidar Brigade, one of the very tough, highly motivated, ultra-nationalist brigades of the Ukrainian military, has indeed been redeployed to this area. And Syrsky seems to be trying to redeploy some of Ukraine's few remaining air defense assets to this area as well. Group of Forces North has released a video of the of a Russian missile strike, which destroyed a Ukrainian Buk air defense missile launcher in the general area of the battlefronts. So he has tried to redeploy some forces to this area, to the area of Kursk and Sumy region, in order to try to stabilize the situation there. But all of these efforts at stabilization have been complete failures. It's quite clear to me that, contrary to what he says, the Ukrainian troops are indeed surrounded, or mostly surrounded. And his claim that the Ukrainians are falling back towards more defensible lines is, in this kind of situation where a chaotic collapse seems to be underway. Anyway, it looks completely surreal. Now, let's now go to what the other side is saying. And yesterday, Group of Forces North published their own comments about the situation, and this covers the situation as of the end of 10th March, And this is what Group of Forces North says. On 10th March, Group of Forces North continued to carry out attacks to liberate the Kursk region. During the course of fierce battles, we liberated Ivashkovsky, Zazulevka, Kubatkin, Martinovka, Bondarevka, Agronom, and Kolmakov. Our troops have come close to Sudzha from the northeast and east, and the route to Yunakovka, that is a village in Ukraine, by the way, in Sumy region, has long been under our fire control. Thus, the decisive battle for Sudzha will begin in the near future. And then they comment on what Syrsky has been saying and what he is likely to do. At the moment, Syrsky, who hastened to report on the regrouping of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Sudzha border area and to refute reports of the complete encirclement of his forces, is considering three options: the creation of Fortress Sudzha, a breakthrough escape attempt of the Ukrainian contingent to Sumy region, and a counteroffensive through the forests in the vicinity of Kurilovka, as another village, to unblock the Sudzha garrison. The Ukrainian armed forces themselves have lost contact with the Kiev command. That's to say, the garrison in Sudzha is no longer in communication with the leadership, the Ukrainian military leadership in Kiev. And they have been fleeing en masse from the district centre for the second day, falling under the blows of our artillery and our drones. The chaotic flight of the enemy leads to colossal losses among personnel and military equipment, but this does not stop the enemy soldiers, who are panicking, afraid of being completely surrounded in another fortress. The transfer of the IDA brigade, as well as units of the 225th Death Regiment, I don't know what military formation of the Ukrainian army that is, by the way, to the forests in the vicinity of Kurilovka has not affected the course of hostilities at the moment. Our Marines are grinding down the enemy reinforcements that have arrived, having already destroyed several enemy combat groups. Fierce fighting also continues in the forested area of the Sudzha district, where our units are advancing in all areas with stubborn fighting, driving the enemy out of equipped strongholds. It is too early to talk about the complete collapse of the enemy. Syrsky considers the failure of the Kursk adventure as a personal defeat, and he is ready to sacrifice part of the conventional Dnipro region in order to maintain control over several meters of occupied Russian land. The total advance of our troops in Kursk region on 10th March amounted to 22.7 kilometers. 23 units of enemy armored vehicles were destroyed. 23 kilometers of advance, almost 23 kilometers of advance, and a whole string of villages falling under Russian control. Well, that was yesterday. This morning, Group of Forces North has published further information. They're now saying that the village of Kazachka Loknya, just north of Sudzha, has also fallen, that the Russians are now in control of that village as well. And they're also saying, there are also reports circulating that Russian troops have actually entered Sudzha. Now, earlier today, a picture appeared that appeared to show, it was a picture of certain buildings inside Sudzha. Supposedly, this picture, this photo, had been taken by Russian soldiers. It shows a completely deserted area. I don't know for a fact that this is indeed taken by Russian soldiers today. There's no sign of Russian soldiers in this photograph. As I said, the area looks completely deserted. But then again, it might have been. And there are more reports circulating that there are indeed now Russian troops, that the Russian troops have indeed entered Sudzha itself, that is to say, the residential metropolitan area of Sudzha. And apparently the entire town is in the process of being stormed by the Russians against minimal resistance. So we are probably or possibly in the last hours of the Battle of Sudzha itself. It could be that by this evening Sudzha will be under Russian control. It could be that we are witnessing the final collapse of the entire Ukrainian occupation in Kursk region. The entire pocket, the entire Sudzha pocket, is collapsing, as many have said, like a house of cards. Now, one very senior Russian military chief, in fact, the most senior of all Russian military chiefs, General Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff and the overall commander of Russian forces throughout the territory of the special military operation, he has also just visited Kursk region. And the Russian Defense Ministry tells us a little bit about his visit, and it reveals the identity of the Russian general who commands the Russian troops in Kursk region and who has won or is in the process of winning for Russia the single most complete and decisive victory that the Russian army has achieved in this war so far. So I will read the report. Chief of the Russian Armed Forces General Staff, First Deputy Defense Minister General of the Army Valery Gerasimov, inspected the formations and units of the Kursk group of forces, eliminating the enemy that has infiltrated the Kursk region. At the command post, the Chief of the General Staff was informed by the commander of the Kursk group of forces, Colonel General Valery Solodchuk, as well as commanders of the formations and other officials on the current situation and progress made during the missions. General of the Army Valery Gerasimov noted the success of the Kursk group of forces in carrying out tasks and gave instructions for further actions. And there's actually a brief photographic study in which we see Gerasimov handing out decorations. Well, that tells us the name of the Russian general who is, as I said, in overall charge of the Russian troops in Kursk. It is General Solodchuk, General Valery Solodchuk. It's the first time, by the way, I've heard of this general over the course of this battle, over the course of this conflict. The overall commander of Group of Forces North, to whom General Solodchuk reports, is General Lapin, General Alexander Lapin. But it is General Solodchuk who is the battlefield commander in Kursk region. And well, we see how skillfully he has conducted this battle. And I can't help but think that we're going to hear an awful lot more of him probably in the next few weeks and months. Anyway, that was earlier today, and shortly before I did this program, we've had more reports from the Russian Defense Ministry. They say the Group of Forces North have liberated 12 settlements during offensive actions: Agronom, Bogdanovka, Bondarevka, Dmitriukov, Zazulevka, Ivashkovsky, Kolmakov, Kubatkin, Martinovka, Mikhailovka, Pravda, Yuzhny, and more than 100 square kilometers of Kursk region. And shortly afterwards, we got more reports, including from, as I said, Group of Forces North, and they have just reported that Sudzha Ukrainians, this village immediately to the north of Sudzha, the place where many assumed that the Ukrainians would try at least make a stand, that Sudzha Ukrainians has also fallen. And as I said, we've had those photographs purportedly taken by Russian troops inside Sudzha itself and operating apparently with reports that the Russians are inside Sudzha. As I said, this has been a collapse without precedent over the course of this conflict. A Russian journalist who reports about the war, I've mentioned him on previous programs, Yuri Podolyaka. He's actually, by the way, of Ukrainian origin. Anyway, he has said that he's never seen events play out quite as fast as this. Rybar has been saying much the same, other Russian reporting channel. Both Podolyaka and Rybar very often very critical of the Russian army. But we see on this occasion that they're reporting this collapse. And even they, grudging about any success that the Russian military achieves, have to acknowledge the scale of the victory that the Russian military is achieving in Kursk and the speed at which events are playing out. So, there we go. It is not impossible. I'm not predicting it because, to repeat again, I'm not there. But it is not impossible, if the Russian troops are indeed inside Sudzha, that Sudzha itself might fall under Russian control within the next 12 hours. Just saying, or at least within the next day. My impression is that Ukrainian resistance has effectively collapsed. The group of forces north talks about desperate attempts by the Ukrainian troops to escape and to flee south into Sumy region. Group of forces north talks about the Russians hunting them with artillery and drones, and about hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers being killed. There are more reports and photographs of Ukrainian troops being captured. There are reports that the Ukrainians, as they gradually digest the scale of the collapse in Kursk region, are now thinking of creating a defense line in Sumy region inside Ukraine around this village of Yumakovka that group of forces north mentioned in that bulletin that I referred to. But to be frank, the Ukrainian forces at the moment seem so disorganized that if the Russians decide to pursue them, I wonder whether a defense can indeed be organized in Yumakovka successfully to hold the Russians back. And as for any reinforcements that Syrsky chooses to send to try to stem this rout in Kursk region, well, all I can say about that is that it seems to me that the risk is that, given the scale of the rout, given the scale of the collapse, any Ukrainian military unit sent to the area in order to stabilize the situation is going to be swept along in this rout itself and might find that it is collapsing also. Now, a group of forces north said that the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region have lost contact with their high command in Kiev, and there's a report about this in TASS, and the official Russian TASS news agency. Ukrainian soldiers who have lost contact with the Kiev command have been fleeing en masse from the district center, that means Sudzha, for the second consecutive day, coming under attack from our artillery and drones. The chaotic retreat has resulted in colossal losses of personnel and military equipment. And, well, there we go. So, we'll see what happens. Might be over within the next 12, 24 hours. We'll see how big the bag of the prisoners ultimately is. And at the moment, one can only guess at the scale of the Ukrainian losses, but they must run into the many hundreds, some are saying thousands. So the entire Kursk offensive, the entire Kursk operation is in its final hours. It has ended in ignominy. Zelensky's grand offensive into Kursk region in August has visited upon Ukraine the biggest military disaster in its short history. Now, exceeding all of the others, Ilovaisk in 2014, Debaltseve in 2015, the fall of Bakhmut, the fall of Avdiivka, what we're seeing in Kursk is worse, much worse than any of those. Now, I'm going to finish this roundup by talking about or discussing an article that has appeared in the British media, which also describes these events, but does so from a very different perspective than mine. And this is an article written by Dan Sabat, Defence and Security Editor, and it's in The Guardian, and its title is Russian Forces Threaten Border in Efforts to Push Ukrainian Army Out of Kursk, which is an interesting way of describing it. The Russians driving the Ukrainians out of Russia are threatening the Ukrainian border. Apparently, another Russian invasion of Ukraine is about to happen. Just saying. Anyway, that's the way The Guardian describes it. And the article then goes on to say Russian forces are trying to cross the border and gain a foothold in Ukraine's Sumy region as they press ahead with a counteroffensive aiming to eliminate the last of Kiev's positions in the Russian Kursk region. A Ukrainian state border guard spokesman, Andrei Demchenko, told national television that Russian forces were trying to advance around the Ukrainian village of Novenka and cut off supply lines. Now, virtually all the reporting channels, by the way, and for the record, say that Novenka is already under Russian control. But anyway, and then Demchenko is then quoted as saying, "These are small assault units composed of a few people. They try to penetrate our territory, accumulate forces, and advance further into Ukraine, probably to cut off logistical routes." Yes, that is what they're trying to do. They're trying to cut off logistical routes. All you have to do is to go to the Russian media and you will read all about it. There is no need to insert the word probably, because that is what the Russians, precisely what the Russians say they are doing. And we're then told that the Russian efforts indicate that Moscow does not want to halt its counteroffensive at the national border should it manage to recapture the rest of the shrinking Ukrainian pocket around the village of Sudzha. Notice how Sudzha, which in earlier reports in the media in Britain, including in The Guardian, had been described as this enormously important town, major metropolis, if you like, in Kursk region. I can remember journalists from various Western media channels being taken around Sudzha by the Ukrainians when they were in control of the town, and how they've been shown all the various facilities, the famous department store and all of that. Anyway, now Sudzha, from being an important town in this report, has been demoted to a village to recapture the rest of the shrinking Ukrainian pocket around the village of Sudzha. No doubt we will learn afterwards that Sudzha itself was of no strategic importance, which, by the way, in some respects is actually true. And then we have a long discussion in this article about whether it was a good idea to for the Ukrainians to advance into Kursk at all, and the general consensus appears to be that it was. We have a quote from Nick Reynolds, a land warfare expert with the Royal United Services Institute. He reminded people that Ukraine had offensive potential and they held on to the pocket for a remarkable amount of time. I hesitate to say it wasn't worth the attempt, and it had a shaping effect on Russian thinking. What the last sentence means, a shaping effect on Russian thinking, I'm not really sure. But anyway, that's what we read. And then, of course, we again have the story of the 12,000 North Koreans who joined the fighting in Kursk on Russia's behalf, taking heavy casualties, estimated by Ukraine at 4,000. That's all trotted out in the article as well. Well, this is one way to describe a Ukrainian military catastrophe. It is perhaps a little closer to the realities than General Syrsky's fantastic assertions of yesterday. The situation is completely under control, that we are not surrounded, we're holding our own, we might have to conduct tactical retreats in a few places to more defensible positions. It's a little bit better than that. But in some ways, it's even more insidious and takes us further away from the reality of what has actually happened in Kursk. And by the way, the article again trots out the story, this time attributed to the Institute of the Study of War, that this might have been connected to Donald Trump's decision to stop intelligence sharing. Russian forces are collapsing the northern part of the Ukrainian salient in Kursk Oblast, the Institute for the Study of War wrote on Sunday night, before suggesting that the change in frontline positions may be linked to the withdrawal of US support for Ukraine announced by the White House last week. The temporal correlation, in other words, the fact that these things have happened at the same time, between the suspension of US intelligence sharing with Ukraine and the start of Russia's collapse of the Ukrainian Kursk salient is noteworthy, the ISW said, though it acknowledges the conclusion was tentative and based on emerging observations. As I have said, that is completely impossible. It makes no sense at all. Now, one perhaps might at some point start to see some commentaries floating around in the margins of the media that maybe it wasn't just chance that brought about this Ukrainian collapse, that the temporal correlation in fact speaks of some kind of collusion between the Trump White House and the Russians, that the Americans switched off the intelligence assistance just before the Russians attacked. A completely preposterous theory. As I've already said, the switching off of intelligence assistance will not have made any difference to the fighting in Kursk region. It doesn't work like that in practice. But, be prepared. People will come up with their own explanations, and theories of that kind, theories which have no evidential support and which make no sense at all, might start to appear, and be prepared for them. Anyway, there we go. I've said enough about the situation in Kursk region. The rest of the war, of course, goes on. The Russians continue to advance in southwest Donbass. No doubt we'll be hearing more reports of more advances in Dnipro region especially, and I'm going to make a further guess that after the spring thaw, the Russians will begin a major offensive also in Kharkiv region, given that they've now established a large and stable foothold west of the Oskol River. But this is what I'm going to say today about the military situation on the battlefronts for the moment. Now, last night, Ukraine launched its biggest ever drone attack on Russia. The Russian Defense Ministry claims that it shot down 337 drones in total. Now, most of the reports give the impression that the major target of this drone attack was Moscow and Moscow region. And it is perfectly true that the Russian Defense Ministry is claiming that 97 of the drones that they shot down were indeed shot down over Moscow and Moscow region. But Moscow does not appear to have been the main target of the attack, because the Russian Defense Ministry is also claiming that 135 drones, in other words, more drones than were launched against Moscow, were also launched against Kursk region as well. And it seems to me that this huge Ukrainian drone attack had two purposes. One, probably, was to distract attention away from Ukraine's failure in Kursk region, the defeat in Kursk region. Instead of having people talk about the collapse of the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region, the victory that the Russians are about to achieve there, the total defeat that the Ukrainians have suffered in Kursk region, the way their offensive in Kursk region has ended in complete disaster. Well, get them to talk instead about this huge drone attack that was launched against Russia. But the fact that so much of the effort, the drone effort, was made against Kursk region, roughly 40% of the drones launched last night were directed at Kursk region. That strongly suggests that this was an attempt in some way to disrupt the Russian offensive in Kursk region. Syrsky, after all, in his message said that he had ordered the diversion of robotic weapons to this area, and that does appear to me to refer to drones. And here we see a major effort to conduct a drone strike on the Russian forces in Kursk region. And it was a complete failure, because as we can see, the Russian offensive has proceeded unimpeded. This drone strike has achieved absolutely nothing. So that's the first thing to say. Now, as for the strike on Moscow, and bear in mind, of the 337 drones that the Ukrainians launched, 135 were launched at Kursk region, 97 were launched at Moscow and the Moscow region. So these were the two, by far the two biggest targets. As for the drone attacks on Moscow region, as for the various drone attacks that the Ukrainians conducted elsewhere in Russia, it's the same story. It's large numbers of Ukrainian drones launched against Russia and achieving nothing of any real significance. The Russian military seems to have the situation under control. We've had a report about this from Peskov. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, said All necessary preparations were made well ahead of time. This enables us to ensure the defense of Moscow, the Moscow region, and many other areas. So that's according to Peskov. And we also read that the Russians are congratulating themselves on their success in repelling this drone strike. Apparently 2 civilians were killed, a number of cars were set on fire, some residential buildings in Moscow were hit. When I say buildings, I mean we're talking about enormous apartment buildings. That is the nature of the built-up area in Russian cities and former Soviet cities. So a drone would have to be a very big and powerful drone to make any very appreciable damage to any one of these huge structures. And, well, no doubt over the next couple of hours we'll be getting claims from Ukraine about important facilities, oil refineries and industrial plants and things of that kind that have supposedly been damaged as well. But I have to say that I think it's most unlikely that any significant damage was done. The Russians at the moment seem very satisfied that they've dealt with the situation effectively. And if you go back to what Peskov was saying, then either the Russians had some degree of pre-warning that this drone strike was about to happen, which is perfectly possible, or alternatively, they have worked out where the major Ukrainian drone attacks will take place. They prepared their defenses and they're ready for when the Ukrainians come. Again, to repeat, there is a major disproportion in these Ukrainian drone attacks by the energy and effort expended to carry them out and the limited effects that they have. They create no significant power blackouts anywhere on the territory of Russia. They've not affected the prices of oil or gas or energy anywhere in Russia. They've had minimal effect on everyday life. They've not had any visible effect on the performance of the economy, the Russian economy, and they're not making any fundamental difference to the course of the war. The only thing that can be said about these drone attacks is that they are perhaps requiring the Russians to hold back air defense systems to protect cities and industrial facilities across Russia, air defense facilities which perhaps otherwise they would deploy closer to the front lines. But anyway, that's the drone attack. The big news is not the drone attack. The big news over the last 24 hours is the imminent collapse of the Ukrainian defenses in Kursk region, the final defeat of the Ukrainian forces in Sudzha, in Kursk region, and the possible offensive that the Russians might indeed launch in Kursk region, in Sumy region. That's the only part of the Guardian article I just mentioned, which I think might actually bear some significant connection to the truth. So there we are. When this battle is finished, when the Battle of Kursk region is ended, I suspect that we will see, especially after the spring thaw has ended, a renewed Russian effort in northern Ukraine. As I've discussed in recent programs, the Russians are close to clearing Volchansk. They've had to divert forces from clearing Volchansk to dealing with the situation in Kursk region. Kursk region and the fighting in Volchansk involves the same group of forces north. So General Lapin has had to divide his forces between these two battles. And has nonetheless, and it's important to say this, managed to win both of them. As I said, Volchansk has taken a lot longer than it would otherwise have done, but it is now mostly under Russian control. And in Kursk region, the Russians are about to win their major battle. But anyway, once Kursk region is cleared, it's likely group of forces north will enter Sumy region. They're already in Volchansk, in Kharkiv region. Their forces, Russian forces, another group of Russian forces are west of the Oskol River. There is a possibility that all of these different formations will begin to unite, as has happened in southwest Donbass, at which point the operational crisis for Ukraine, as it could play out over the course of the summer, might become even more grave. Now, all of this is playing out even as the Ukrainians are meeting the Americans in Saudi Arabia. Now, to repeat again, Zelensky himself is not there. The American delegation is led by Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, Donald Trump's national security advisor is there. Also, it seems Steve Witkoff is participating in some of the discussions, though he's also flying today to Doha, where he's going to be dealing with a completely separate set of discussions dealing with the ongoing conflict in Gaza and the ceasefire that is just about still holding there. And there are reports that on Thursday he's going to fly to Moscow, and that he will perhaps, whilst in Moscow, be meeting with Putin himself. The Russians have not confirmed this, but they are saying that they do expect the Americans to brief them fully about how the discussions between the Americans and the Ukrainians in Saudi Arabia have gone. Now, the person who is leading the Ukrainians at the meeting with the Americans in Saudi Arabia is Andrei Yermak. There are other Ukrainian officials also present. The foreign minister, obviously, and others like him. The defense minister, Umerov, is also there. But undoubtedly, the key person is Andrei Yermak, who is Zelensky's chief of staff. Many people believe that Yermak is the real power behind the throne, though I have to say the events of the last couple of weeks have made me start to doubt whether that is really the case. Anyway, Yermak has written an article in The Guardian in advance, which has been published in advance of his meeting with the Americans in Saudi Arabia. And I have to say, as far as I could see, it didn't give an inch. He continued to criticize the Russians. That's unsurprising. He continued to demand more support, more weapons and supplies and money. He demanded a further escalation of sanctions pressure on Russia. He wants more and more sanctions. He wants the loopholes, as he puts it, in the sanctions to be closed. He thinks the pressure on Russia needs to be intensified. He talks about security guarantees, though he's careful not to make it absolutely clear who he believes should supply those security guarantees. But he doesn't say that the security guarantees must be provided by the Europeans, which makes me think that the Ukrainians are still going to go to Saudi Arabia, and they're going to continue to insist on security guarantees from the Americans, despite the Americans repeatedly ruling that out. And, well, I have to say that my overall sense, reading Yermak's article, is that the Ukrainians are not going to Saudi Arabia in any very strong mood to compromise. They're still insisting on their major positions. This is consistent with what I'd heard yesterday, that Zelensky's instructions to the Ukrainian delegation is to make no substantive concessions at all, to continue to insist on security guarantees, including security guarantees from the Americans, to reject ceasefires without security guarantees, to continue to demand the presence of peacekeepers from NATO countries, all of those things. That this continues to be Zelensky's demand, and it's the demand that Yermak is taking with him to Saudi Arabia. Now, the Russians have, of course, already rejected all of this, and they have already rejected the only part of the proposal, the only proposal for a ceasefire that the Ukrainians are running with. This is Macron's proposal for a ceasefire. A cessation of attacks in the air and by sea. In other words, no more bombing, no more missile strikes, no more attacks on naval targets, that kind of thing. A rejection which the Russians quite rightly see as a proposal for a no-fly zone, a disguised proposal for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which they are rejecting. Now, the word, as I understand it, is that this temporary ceasefire is intended to be stage one, phase one in the European plan. Phase two would be a further ceasefire, and as part of that ceasefire, with the no-fly zone already in place, the European troops, the British and the French troops, with the American backstop, would at that point enter Ukraine. This is a fantastic proposal which the Russians have already rejected and which they are certain to reject again if it is ever put to them. And I wonder whether it's going to ride with the Americans. Marco Rubio has gone to the meeting with a rather different perspective. He has said that the Ukrainians must give a clear indication that they are indeed prepared to cede, as he put it, some territory to the Russians. And as far as I could see, he said absolutely nothing about security guarantees, certainly not security guarantees provided by the United States. What the Ukrainians are going to say about that, I have no idea. But for the record, and again, I have never seen any Ukrainian official, and I've never heard Zelensky himself, make clear that the Ukrainians are prepared to cede territory to the Russians. The most that I have heard is that they might accept for a temporary period that the Russians continue to occupy some Ukrainian territory, but they still expect it at some point to be returned to them. And that, by the way, includes Crimea as well. So on the face of it, the gulf between the Americans and the Ukrainians remains enormous, though it's fair to say that the American position is still very much a work in progress. It's not been established or sorted out, but we'll see what comes of this meeting in Saudi Arabia. The word is that Donald Trump does want some much more concrete steps taken by the Ukrainians towards peace. Logically, if that is the case, he will not accept these Ukrainian proposals, which, as I said, are not really peace proposals at all. And Well, we'll see what his negotiators decide to do and how it plays out. But let me repeat again a point I've made many times, which is that in a profound sense, in a true sense, this war which has been waged has already been won in military terms by Russia. That is not to say that there would not be at least perhaps a year of very hard fighting still to do for the Russians to complete their victory. This, of course, on the basis that American intelligence assistance and military supplies are resumed. But the Russians have been making steady progress in Ukraine, despite the fact that the Americans up to now have been providing intelligence assistance and military supplies. And simply returning to the sterile Biden policy of continuing to provide military assistance and intelligence supplies and waiting for the Russians to come round, all that is going to do is guarantee ultimately a Russian military victory and a crisis even more massive than the one we're seeing at the moment. Now, I say that there's been more attempts, there's been a renewal of attempts to resurrect the old narrative that in fact this is a war of attrition and it is a stalemate, but it is a stalemate that if anything is tilting in Ukraine's favour. There was an article in The Atlantic magazine in the United States which said that, and there is a similar article in The Economist saying the same thing, that the Russians are losing huge numbers of men, tens upon tens of thousands of men, for limited, minimal gains. This is so at variance from the actual realities of the battle that it's difficult to know what planet the people who are writing these things are on. Obviously, they are very, very heavily influenced by the reports from the Ukrainians and especially from the British Defence Ministry about what they claim Russian losses to be. But we do not ultimately have a complete picture of Russian losses, and the information provided by Mediazona, which, by the way, and as I've said this previously, in my opinion is not quite as rigorous in its collection of data as it used to be. About a year ago, it changed its methodology somewhat to adjust to criticisms from some of its Western sponsors, just saying. But anyway, even allowing for that, these enormous claims of Russian losses simply do not correlate with the data that Mediazona is providing. And they don't look, these claims anyway, do not look at Ukrainian losses. Of course, the Ukrainians give a minimal picture of their losses, as one might expect that they would do. But we don't really know what they are. And yes, there are various Russian platforms and reporting channels that do look at Ukrainian losses. There's some that give different figures. I'm not going to devote a huge amount of time to this. But given how nebulous the information is in terms of losses, I think that any attempt to use that in order to claim that Ukraine is actually winning the war of attrition is, well, it's statistical nonsense. The reality is, and I say this many times, it is Ukrainian brigades that are constantly complaining about how short of men they are, not Russian ones. It is the Ukrainians who are busy trying to round up people in the streets and dragoon them into the army. Something pointed out by J.D. Vance to Zelensky at their meeting in the Oval Office. Zelensky didn't deny it, by the way. I've seen no pictures like that in Russia. There's no apparent shortage of equipment on the Russian side. I remember way back in 2022, the British Ministry of Defence was claiming that something like, was it 2/3 of Russia's armour capability had been destroyed in the first weeks of the war? Well, that obviously was not true. So why place so much faith on these claims? Why not look instead at the reality of Russian advances? Why not look at the catastrophe that has just played out for the Ukrainians in Kursk region? Is that not a much better guide as to who is actually winning the war of attrition at this particular point in time? And just to repeat and to finish, given that the Russians are more heavily equipped, given that they do have far more artillery by every account, that they're able to shell and have shelled the Ukrainians much more heavily at many points in the war, is it not more likely that the Russians are telling the truth when they say that they are inflicting more casualties on the Ukrainians than the Ukrainians are inflicting upon them? Anyway, that is the narrative at the moment. It is a false one. I hope that no one in Washington falls for it. At least I hope no one in the Trump team falls for it. It's clearly being dressed up in order to persuade the Americans to recommit to the war. Ukraine is not winning the war. It is clearly losing. And if the first tentative moves towards peace break down because unacceptable proposals are made to the Russians, proposals which everyone knows the Russians are going to reject, well, all that will do is that it will mean that in a couple of months' time, when the Russians reach the Dnieper, or worst still, when they cross it, we will have a far worse operational crisis than the one we have at the moment. Anyway, we'll see what comes of all of these talks in Saudi Arabia, and if it is indeed the case that Witkoff is indeed going to Moscow on the 13th of March, we'll see what happens when he gets there and what the Russians say to him. I'm going to here express my own personal view. Overall, I am still on the side of hope in this matter. I think that the Americans have seen through the Ukrainians. I think they have a pretty clear understanding of what the overall situation in the war actually is. I think that if the Ukrainians come with proposals like the ones that Yermak's article suggests they're coming with, the Americans will shoot them down, and the Americans will tell the Ukrainians that is nowhere near enough. The Ukrainians have to go back and rethink this through and come up with something better. And perhaps, just possibly, the Americans will keep up the pressure by refusing to restore the intelligence assistance and refusing to restore the military supplies, in which case, over time, Ukraine's position will begin to deteriorate. Anyway, that's what I think is most likely to happen. But if I was to say that I knew that for certain, I would be going further than I know. Now, in the meantime, the first article has appeared in the British media, which straightforwardly says that Zelensky needs to stand down. And again, somewhat surprisingly, it's appeared in the Daily Telegraph, though it is written by a journalist, Alexander Temerko, Well, I don't pretend I know, and I assume from his name that he is Ukrainian. But anyway, the article reads, Zelensky should stand down to save his country. There is a silver lining to the truculence in the Oval Office, and that is that it might cause Zelensky to leave the scene. Now, the first thing to say is to ask why articles like this are starting to appear in the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph, after all, has been the most fervid advocate of Ukraine in the entire media landscape in Britain since the start of the conflict. Before the conflict began, before the special military operation began, the Daily Telegraph was quite straightforward in criticising the Minsk agreement, in saying that the Minsk agreement needed to be shelved. It then trumpeted every Ukrainian success or alleged success. It ridiculed the Russian war effort. It spread endless stories about Vladimir Putin, about Russia, about the wickedness of the Russians. It still does, by the way, in that it hasn't changed at all. But some of its readers might have started to notice over the last 2 or 3 weeks that a discordant note has started to appear. We've had commentaries in the Daily Telegraph explaining the terrible condition of the British Armed Forces, explaining why it would be a reckless mistake to deploy British troops on any kind of peacekeeping mission to Ukraine. And now we have an article in the Daily Telegraph. The first article, as I said, that I've seen in the British media, floating the possibility that the time has come for Zelensky to go. Well, there are possible political reasons for this. The Daily Telegraph is a right-wing newspaper. It's been reasonably, though not very sympathetic to Donald Trump. It certainly preferred him to Kamala Harris in the recent election, but not with any, as I said, marked enthusiasm. It perhaps feels a certain ideological kinship with the current Trump administration, and it might not want to go too far out of line with the Trump administration for that reason. But I think the overwhelming reason why the Daily Telegraph is becoming slightly more concerned, shall we say, about the war is that it has historically had a certain connection to the British defence and security establishment. It's a newspaper, for example, that's led by many British Army officers and people of that kind. And it probably knows that there is little enthusiasm, to put it mildly. In fact, there is overwhelming reluctance to send British troops into the line of fire in Ukraine. And anyway, the article makes some very interesting points. It says that the Ukrainian president has collapsed his own foreign policy and alienated his key partner. He then fled to European capitals, not as a statesman, but as a supplicant. Now his weakness becomes clear, and he wants to return to the minerals deal that he scorned. He says, the article goes on to say that relying on the Europeans is an act of defiance, but also a demonstration of vulnerability. Though European leaders embraced Zelensky, they did so with words, not swords. Europe has the money, skills and enthusiasm to protect Ukraine, but Ukraine does not have the time to wait until Europe resuscitates its military industry. Europe would need 3 to 4 years to build the military force and industry capable of shifting the war's balance for Ukraine. No chance, by the way. Certainly not in 3 to 4 years. 5 to 10 is more realistic. By that time, the Russian army may be at the western borders of Ukraine. It is 3 years that Ukraine does not have. Russia is reinforcing and will begin a massive offensive by the end of this year. It might be sooner than that. Macron's strong words do not stop tanks. The only army capable of stopping the Russians' offensive is the re-equipped, resupplied Ukrainian army supported by America as well as Europe. And he then goes on to say that it is not too late for Ukraine, but it may be too late for Zelensky. He stripped himself of the role of an equal partner and has become instead a client. And Europe is not really, therefore, in a position to take America's place. And Zelensky, having thrown his stone, now finds himself trapped, his position weakened rather than strengthened. He must return to America, accept that Ukraine's power lies in partnership with the United States, and sign on to Trump's deal. America has the ability to deliver a settlement, not only for Ukraine, but for Europe as well. And in other words, there really isn't any other option for Ukraine than to make up with the Americans, because Europe is a broken reed. They may talk a big game, but they're not in any position to deliver on what they promise. Only America can, waiting for the Europeans, whilst alienating the Americans. All that will do is guarantee the end of Ukraine. And then the article starts to talk about the fact that Ukraine needs to change its leader. The time has come for Ukraine to think about how it should proceed. There is a clear conflict between Zelensky's interests and those of Ukraine itself. His continued grip on power is no longer serving the national interest, and his attitude is actively harming Ukraine's chance for peace, as we saw in the Oval Office. It is time for him to agree to oversee democratic elections and make way for a government of national unity. This unity government should include representatives from all pro-Ukrainian factions, excluding pro-Russian elements, of course, ensuring true national representation. So no Viktor Medvedchuk. The government of national unity has to be made up of pro-Ukrainian factions. One of those, obviously, is the one led by Yulia Tymoshenko. Could it be that she is the person who might fulfill the role of leading it? And then the article goes on to say Ukraine's defense must be placed in the hands of its most capable commanders, with General Zaluzhny leading military operations with the rank of Supreme Commander, free from political interference. So he will not be the new interim president of Ukraine. He will not be the person leading the new national unity government. Someone else will. Someone else who, as I've just said, might be Yulia Tymoshenko. Who else, realistically, could it be? And furthermore, new limits must be established to curb the presidential office's involvement in military and business affairs, ensuring that governance is centred on the country's survival and future rather than personal gain and self-PR. An interesting criticism of Zelensky. And then the article says, in theory, Zelensky could remain, note the word theory, in theory, Zelensky could remain as a caretaker president in a temporary head of state capacity until new elections are held, but those elections must be announced now and must take place this year. If he steps down willingly, he has the chance to preserve his legacy as a hero of Ukraine. And this is the only way forward. Ukraine can go ahead and sign its mineral rights deal and work with Trump to secure its own future. And the article ends that President Zelensky will deliver a peace deal that requires discipline, strategy, and leadership, but does not put personal ego before national survival. Zelensky played his role in history, but history moves forward, and it is time for Ukraine to do the same. There is a silver lining to Zelensky's truculence in the Oval Office and flight to Europe. It has woken Europe to the reality that it must end its 70-year torpor and re-enter the global race. Putin's Russia is a brutal aggressor and an enemy of Europe, the Western democracy more broadly. We need to keep our powder dry and build up Europe's defences en masse to counter the Russian threat. We'll put all the last part aside. This is clearly an agenda for setting up a Tymoshenko government. Now, it's appeared in the Daily Telegraph. We're told that Mr. Tymoshenko is a British-Ukrainian politician, businessman, and member of the Advisory Council of the Institute of Economic Affairs. As I said, I've never come across him before, but it seems to me that what he is basically floating here is a proposal for Zelensky to go and for Tymoshenko to take over and for Tymoshenko to then work with Trump to sign some kind of peace agreement with Russia. Forget about Europe. They're all talk, they're no action. They're never going to provide Ukraine with the means it needs to defend itself. There has to be a peace agreement. Trump is the only person who can provide it. The alternative is Ukraine going down to complete defeat, and we need to negotiate now, and Zelensky is not the man to do it. Now, I'm going to say straight away, I think that talk in Western capitals of Zelensky exiting the scene is circulating. I think that it probably has first been broached in the United States. I think that some people in Europe are also perhaps gradually coming round to that idea as well. But, as I've said already, it will be more difficult to do than I think many of these plotters or would-be plotters realise. Zelensky is now very embedded in the Ukrainian structures. The American analyst Gordon Hahn has done a brilliant piece about this. He's pointed out that whatever you may think of Zelensky, whatever views you may have of his bizarre personality, he is the one person who, in a sense, manages to hold things in Ukraine together. Despite Zelensky's weakened position domestically and internationally, this at least partially illegitimate president, these are Gordon Hahn's words, may be the last or next to last surviving pillar of the Maidan regime and the Ukrainian state, for all his narcissism, egoism, corruption, and mounting authoritarianism. Zelensky currently holds the Ukrainian elite together and is the face of Ukraine abroad, still well liked in Europe. He remains a figure that minimally satisfies all the various factions in Ukrainian politics and is able to hold off opposition elements, many of which he has emasculated by banning parties and media and by either forcing their leaders into exile or arresting them. For example, former President Poroshenko and Viktor Medvedchuk. Now, I appreciate that people talk about Zelensky, but we see this article in the Daily Telegraph does not see a political role for Zelensky. It sees him instead as a military chief, restored as a military chief to hold the Russians at bay until the settlement comes. Others are talking of Kirilo Budanov. I have to say that I think that Budanov, for all sorts of reasons, would not be a satisfactory candidate for the Americans either, if only because the Russians would be certain to reject him. My own take is that the Americans, as I said, will cut the Ukrainians no slack at this meeting in Saudi Arabia. They're probably not going to accept the things that the Ukrainians say. I think more likely they will continue to put the squeeze on Ukraine, and they will work hard to try to persuade him eventually to go and to leave the door open for Tymoshenko to take over. I think increasingly this is the American plan. Now, I'm not confident it will succeed. As I said, I can easily see Zelensky digging in. I think it's going to be very difficult to remove him, even for the United States. I think Tymoshenko has many opponents in Kiev. I think most of them would be extremely alarmed at the thought of Tymoshenko, who has a reputation for being ruthless in her treatment of her rivals and enemies, and treacherous and duplicitous as well, and massively cunning to boot. I think that many of them would be very alarmed at the thought of her return to active politics in Ukraine. So I could see tremendous crisis and conflict at work in Kiev. But the key thing to understand is that the clock on Ukraine is ticking. The Russians continue to advance. We've just watched this collapse in Kursk region. And, well, even this article in the Daily Telegraph acknowledges that unless some kind of peace settlement is achieved, the Russians eventually will find their way to Ukraine's western border. So time is short, probably shorter than the author of that article realizes. We will see what happens. This is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.